Hello and welcome to this week's Bible in the News. We're now coming to the end of the 9th month of the war in Ukraine, which was expected by many to be over within just a few weeks, if not a few days. Before the invasion, the Russian military had supposedly undergone major restructuring and modernisation. It was feared and believed to be only second to the United States in military might. This all changed within the first week of the war, which exposed major deficiencies in its capabilities, particularly in regard to logistics, discipline, corruption, morale, and training. The war began with a thrust toward Kiev, going straight for the throat of the regime, presumably with the aim of quickly overthrowing the government there. The West, although supportive, were reluctant to give Ukraine the most advanced weapons, only for them to fall straight into the hands of the Russian army if the Russian army proved successful. But from the beginning they sent large numbers of basic arms, with which the Ukrainians put remarkably effective use. The Ukrainian military on purposely targeted vehicles in key locations, blocking roads as well as taking out the first and last vehicle in convoys, trapping vehicles in between. They took out key logistic vehicles such as fuel trucks and transport vehicles. This led to substantial difficulties with the logistics for the Russian forces in Ukraine, and withheld them from having the supplies they required to take a major city such as Kiev. This was made more challenging by the fact that the supplies had to come first through Belarus before being able to even enter Ukraine. By April, the Russian army had decided to conduct a withdrawal from the north of the country and rather focus on pushing the Ukrainians from the east, from Donbass, and also from the south through Crimea. But over the summer, the advance slowed, and what began to look like a stalemate started to form. As the survival of Zelensky's Ukraine, in some form at least, began to seem more and more likely, the West began to be more and more confident sending increasingly sophisticated arms to the Ukrainian military, and in large numbers. US made HIMARS, which is a mobile rocket system capable of taking out Russian tanks up to 50 miles behind the lines, were first sent in June, with devastating consequences. They have been used to take out ammunition depots, Russian command centres, and in particular bridges over the Dnieper River, leading to yet more supplies issues, which motivated the Russians to recently pull back to the east side of the river, surrendering the city of Kherson to the Ukrainian forces. In September, Ukraine used a thunder run to force the Russians back in the north, taking over 3,000 square kilometres in just 6 days. As is often in war, counter-arguments are made regarding the number of losses on each side. If Ukraine's military is to be believed, the Russian army has lost a third of its standing army, either killed, wounded, or prisoners of war. They claim that nearly 90% of Russia's tanks have either been captured or destroyed, over 40% of their armoured combat vehicles, and nearly a third of their artillery taken out. Now, Ukraine's official figures are very questionable and are likely to be exaggerated, but it is clear that the Russians have suffered significant losses, not only in military equipment, but perhaps more importantly, in military prestige. The Russian army, which was once feared, is now being laughed at, which was the exact opposite of what Putin wanted to achieve. But we do not know how this will all end, but it seems unlikely that it will end with a complete Russian victory, as many had suspected at the beginning of the war. Neither will it end with the same, let alone more, fear of the Russian army existing around the world. However, we know from Ezekiel 38 that there will be a time when Russia leads Europe as part of its confederacy down into the Middle East. Ezekiel 38, verse 1, we read, "And the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws, and will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Dagama of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Thou shalt ascend, and come like a storm, and shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. And so we know that the east and the west will come together at that time, but it is likely that we will be called to judgment a good while before this invasion. And comparisons have been made between this war in Ukraine and the USSR's war in Finland in 1939, also known as the Winter War, where the USSR attempted to invade Finland only to be humiliated by a tiny Finnish army, who proved particularly good in fighting in wintry conditions, while the Soviet Union did not. It was only 5 years later that the Soviet Union stood at the doors of Berlin, having swept all before it. The Russians are experiencing fighting against some of the West's most advanced military equipment, and we can be sure that lessons have been learned and will continue to be learned as the war progresses. The West appear to believe that if the Russian army is forced out of Ukraine, they will give up any idea of rebuilding their empire. They seem to believe that Putin is the only person in Russia with this aim, but the reality is Putin has substantial support within Russia, and should Putin be toppled, a change of tactics is likely to be the only consequence. We are only 9 months into this war, which could take some time. It would be politically hard for Putin to withdraw from Ukraine without losing his position, as would it be for Zelensky to accept Russian sovereignty over substantial amounts of territory. Accepting the loss of territory to Russia from military conquest would go against the doctrine of the world order since the end of the Second World War, and would surely be a difficult precedent going forward. And so this war will likely only come to an end when one side has no alternative at all but to accept the terms of the other. According to rumours, a split has begun to appear between the EU on one side and Britain and the United States on the other, with the EU apparently urging Zelensky to negotiate an end to the war, presumably as the war has a greater impact on the EU economy, which is suffering record inflation due to the price of natural gas. And so we must wait to see how these things conclude. Russia has far from lost this war. They could yet double down and perform the transformation they made in the early 1940s. And so we are yet to see how it will all end. But however it does end, we can be confident that the time will come when Russia does lead Europe, as the head of that confederacy, down into the Middle East and against the land of Israel. And so let us watch these things as they develop, because the kingdoms of men are controlled by our God in heaven, not by the will of men. He is guiding things according to his plan, so that all the pieces come together at that time. This has been Paul Barnes joining you for this week's Bible in the News.